Major support for these programs is provided by Bank of America Merrill Lynch and Perfect Building Maintenance, New York Community Bank, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, M&T Bank, Chase Commercial Term Lending. Additional support is provided by Briarwood Organization, Bruce Mosler, Capital One Bank, Cassidy Turley, C.B. Richard Ellis, Chelsea Lighting, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, DDG Partners, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, Friedman LLP, Accountants and Advisors, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Genova Burns and Gian Tomasi, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Centurion Holdings, Corman Communities, Madison Realty Capital, Margolin Weiner and Evans, LLP, Certified Public Accountants and Business Advisors, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Sterling and Sterling, SJP Properties, Stonehenge Partners, the Wickoff Group, Urban American, and Ackman Ziff Real Estate, Ariel Property Advisors, Eastern Consolidated, Essex Capital Partners, Goldman Properties, Moynihan Group, Musk Development, RAL Development Services, the Spandrel Group, LLC, Rosewood Realty Group, Terra CRG, Triangle Equities.
His name is Marvin Josephson. He is the super agent. He's the man who's been responsible for creating Marvin Josephson Associates, ICM, International Creative Management. And he's my guest today in our second part of an interview. So Marvin, last week when we were discussing, we just reached the time that your friend who worked in public affairs and you were going out, and he didn't go out, but you started. And there's an interesting, you're starting in your business, you're 28, you're married, you have 2 twin daughters, and somebody who's representing Gene Autry says to you, I need you to write a contract. Tell me about that.
Okay. And this person, his specialty, he came from Hollywood, was doing merchandising deals for personalities, like maybe they were for Gene Autry, toy guns, or whatever.
And Trigger, you know, he had the horse also,
yeah,
right?
And, but in this case, he was selling old Gene Autry Western, singing Western films to Channel 2. This is when I worked at CBS. And since that was the lowest order of contracts you did, I was the junior guy, so I got to do this contract. And now after I'm in business, I get a call from Mitch. And the call was, hey, kid, I want you to write a contract, hopefully 1 page, maximum 2 pages, and keep it simple. I want it to be binding, but I don't want a lot of whereases in it, because I don't want this guy I'm dealing with to feel he has to go get a lawyer. So first I said, Mitch, you don't understand, I'm not a lawyer anymore. Of course I was technically a lawyer. He said, hey, you're talking to me. You need the couple $100. He figured he could get me at half or a quarter of what he'd have to pay his regular lawyer. And this guy was on ABC. The person he wanted to sign up was on ABC Local, and he had a children's show named Tinker's Workshop. And I did a very simple contract in which he paid no money, but he said he would arrange merchandising contracts. And he got 50% of what the actor involved, Bob Keeshan, would make in the future.
Now, yes.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is...
No, and then, after that was done, a couple of months later, Bob had come up with a show that became, the show became Captain Kangaroo, got on the air October 3, 1955, so that's 6 months after it left. There was an agency involved, General Artists Corporation, which I later bought.
The interesting situation is that he really couldn't leave because he was under contract with ABC.
Absolutely.
And you did a very creative, interesting thing. ABC didn't want to release him, but ABC was interested in the Tinker product that he had. So
they made the mistake that suits often make. Instead of thinking that the real thing to hold onto is the guy, they said, if you'll give us the rights to put on, continue Tinker's Workshop with someone else, we'll release you personally. You go do whatever you want.
And that was what you were able to accomplish. So here's Bob Keeshan, who is originally Clarabelle and Howdy Doody, going back
Absolutely.
Years later. He then is Tinker's Workshop, and then all of a sudden, through the creative design that you took care of, you let them take over the Tinker's situation, and Bob then, in 1955, I believe, creates Captain Kangaroo.
Right, which was on the air Monday through Friday, 2 hours live, because it was also rebroadcast on the West Coast. So, and Bob was the same age, so, and that show lasted 29 years.
29 years. I mean, and many of the things that came out of Captain Kangaroo really grew into Sesame Street.
Well, most of the people who worked on the original Sesame Street had trained on Captain Kangaroo as writers, producers, directors.
Now, what's interesting, this is October 5th, 1955. Thanksgiving is November of that year. And Bob Keeshan is, you know, people who are younger don't remember that Macy's, the FMH Macy's company, owned in New Jersey a retailer by the name of Bamberger's.
In Newark.
In Newark. And the headquarters of Bamberger's, as you just said, was in Newark, New Jersey. And Newark, New Jersey was a thriving retail environment. It was a thriving community. The Ironbound today continues. And they had a parade, just like
except theirs was the night before Thanksgiving, and the Macy's parade was the morning of Thanksgiving.
Hey, you couldn't. They were, you know, they were still owned by the same people.
No, and this Channel 2 would be covering both.
So what happens on the night before Thanksgiving? There are people working in the studio, in the green room, and you meet some of these news reporters were...
In those days, CBS allowed its news commentators to do what was called color broadcasting. Today, that wouldn't be allowed. It's beneath their dignity. So they had the very distinguished Charles Collingwood, who'd been one of Ed Murrow's boys in
London. Who was a Rhodes Scholar. I mean, he had an unbelievable educational background.
Oh, and there was a green room, and I met Collingwood in the green room because I was there for Keeshan. And I said, why don't we have lunch? And that's when I got involved with news people.
So he was one of your first,
he was the first newsman.
Now, over the years, you know, people remember there was Brinkley, you know.
Well, I represented both Brinkley and Huntley, the producer of the show. I had Frank McGee, who was the number 3 guy, and I had an interesting experience with Reuben Frank. He was the producer. So I got to know Reuben, and I said, Reuben, let me represent you. And Reuben thought about it a lot. He wasn't into money. And he said, okay. So I had to call this very exalted guy, executive vice president, and he had one of these offices like out of a Hollywood mogul, you know, where you walked a long way and he sat at a desk on a platform. And I finally get there, I sit down, he says, "What do you want?" Well, of course he knew what I wanted, otherwise I wouldn't get the appointment. So I said, "I'm here representing Reuven Frank." He said, "Reuven Frank is a staff member at NBC. We do not deal with outsiders for staff members. Goodbye." So I left his office, and NBC was in the same 30 Rock. So I go down to see Reuven. I said, "Reuven, this is what happened." Reuven sat down at his typewriter and typed out his resignation. And by the way, he later became president of NBC News. And he sent it up by one of his people to this guy. I think his name was Adams. And of course, I got to negotiate Reuven's contract. And the end of the story is, I went down to see Reuven after I negotiated, and I'd gotten him like 3 times what he was making. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Marvin, that's obscene."
Hey, it was obscene. Now, you know, people, recently Dick Clark passed on, and you represented Dick Clark. You met him in Philadelphia. Tell me about Dick Clark. How'd you meet him?
Well, he'd met a lawyer who had done some legal work for Dick. Dick was then local in Philadelphia. And I got to meet Dick through him, and I became Dick's agent.
You know, I briefly alluded at the beginning of the show that when you started the broadcast
Management.
it was located on 57th Street in a closet, correct?
Yeah. One of these so-called clients that was going to have lent me a closet.
So what happens later on? You grow because of the newscasting people, Dick Clark, many other people, and then you decide to grow. Let's talk about the growth of Marvin Josephson.
Well, it was actually the very first year. By now I had Captain Kangaroo in the air. I started talking mergers. I didn't have money for acquisitions. And I just knew that I wanted not to be some small agent dependent on a small number of people, and if one of them left, maybe that's half the income. And eventually, I hooked up with a very distinguished agency in California. It was small, but they had people like Bing Crosby, who was a giant personality. And it was called Rosenberg Coriel. And they had other people.
Was that the ones who like going to Chasen's?
Yeah.
Restaurant? Now, you were based in New York, but you had an apartment later on.
Well, that's later.
Later on, but they were in California, and you told me this. Tell me the story because.
Well, I went out there, and they took me to dinner, and Chasen's was like the Four Seasons in New York. It was the
place to be seen.
Place to be, and we're seated right by the door, and everybody who came in seemed to know my partners. And they would stop and chat, so we couldn't really talk. And I said, "Couldn't we get a quiet place in the back?" And George Rosenberg, known as Rosie, he called me Huck Finn. He said, "Huck, when we're in New York, you pick where we sit. When we're in California, Los Angeles, I pick where we sit. This is the best seat in the whole house."
Now, you bought that agency, then you did another.
No, well, we were partners, and then they weren't as ambitious as I was. And I wanted to spend money hiring more people, and I eventually bought them out, and that's when Marvin Josephson Associates name came into being.
Then what about the next agency where you meet Steve McQueen? That was another merger, right?
Well, you're jumping a little ahead of the story, but I bought a number of agencies, including Chase and Park Citron, and they represented, these were all ex-MCA agents, and one of them, George Jason, represented such stars as Clark Gable. Now we're moving into serious, big time. But what I remember about them was their great sense of honor. So I made a deal to buy them. And shortly after, like 6 months later, Jaws opened. They represented almost all the profit points in Jaws.
I think when I read that article a number of years ago in the New York Times, they represented like 53%.
Because they had the director, I think they had Spielberg at the time.
They had every side of the action.
But they had a big piece. And so I went to them and said, and remember, we're talking about many years ago. So I said, fellas, this is not fair. I want to pay you another $1 million. They said, no, we made a deal. I had to talk them into taking the $1 million bonus.
Now, when do you go public?
Well, the reason we went public is Steve Ross, the legendary Steve Ross, who ran Time Warner. Steve was then, as you probably know, in the funeral business.
Yes, he was
parking lots.
He was Kinney General. He was in everything.
Okay, and that was through his father-in-law, his then father-in-law, and he decided to buy Warner 7 Arts. But you couldn't own a talent agency and buy a movie studio. And 13 or 14 months before that, he bought a large talent agency called Ashley Famous, or Ashley Steiner Famous. It was Ted Ashley. And his plan was to first he knew he had to sell the agency, and then he wanted Ted to come and run Warner's. So I heard about this, and I contacted Steve, and it had to be an all-cash deal. And it started off at $12 million cash. I, of course, couldn't have raised $100,000 cash. But we made a deal eventually. The price came down to $10 million. But this goes to going public.
Right, but it also relates, you go to the Chase Manhattan originally?
Oh, yeah. To get the money, I had met someone who was my financial advisor, and we had this great meeting with Steve's deputy, who was Sarnoff, Bill Sarnoff. I think he was a nephew of the legendary General Sarnoff. And we shook hands on the deal, and as we left, I said, well, I know you got the money, right? He said, well, I thought you got the money. So here we have a handshake deal, no money. So I go to my local Chase bank. All I had was a checking account there for the business and myself. And it was then at the corner of 57th and 6th Avenue. It's now a Duane Reade. And I said to the local manager, because I had met these 2 insurance companies, so they were each tentatively going to put up $2 million. And I said, I need $6 million. He said, well, that's above my pay grade. Long story short, he introduced me to one of the media bankers downtown at headquarters, and they ended up giving me
They gave you $6 million, and the insurance company, State Mutual and Mass Mutual, gave you the $4 million.
They gave me the 4, and that's where the public thing was, because they had warrants with their preferred stock or whatever it was, and they wanted me at the right time to go public so they could cash out their warrants and get their $4 million back.
With like 10 minutes to go, let's talk about Steve McQueen, the actor. You had...
I want to just add one thing, if you don't mind. So the Chase Bank said, okay, and they checked with different people like Leonard Goldenson who ran ABC. We're going to give you the money, but you have to sign personally. I said, but
I don't have the assets.
the most I could, if I sold my business, maybe I'd have $500,000, if that. They said, we understand that. We don't want you to sleep well until you've paid us back.
Which you subsequently paid back in like 3 years, I believe.
And I never signed again on a corporate line. But
let's talk about Steve McQueen.
Well, Steve McQueen, that's Jeremy, and I own Marvin Josephson Associates, which in turn now own, because we bought Ashley Famous, couldn't use Ashley, so it became International Famous Agency. And I was a public company at this point, and there was another company called Creative Management Associates, and they were a public company, and their company was known as CMA. And because of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, I launched a major effort to raise moral support for Israel in the United States. And we were going to put on an enormous show at
with John
Madison
Wayne.
Square Garden, and then at big screens in arenas all over the country. And, John Wayne. So the producer said to me, look, we've got to get John Wayne to walk through the scrim at Madison Square Garden. The scrim will project a picture of an Israeli tank in the Sinai Desert. So I call Wayne's people, and, Duke Wayne had a reputation of being a right-wing guy, so most Jews are liberal, were, or still are, and think, oh, that's bad. But I decided to find out, so I call. He agrees he'll do it, but he'll have to do it on a videotape, or whatever the equivalent was in those days, because he was doing some commercial in Japan for a ton of money. So the producer says to me, Marvin, no, he's got to walk through the scrim. We can't just project this. So I went back. He canceled the trip to Japan. I agreed to do it. And it never happened because the truce came before we actually went on the air. But for example, Jeff Katzenberg was then like 18 years old, had worked for John Lindsay. He worked on arranging this all around the country. And later, I gave him his first job in the movie department at ICM in New York, which was then not called ICM yet. So the point here is that the guy who ran CMA was Freddie Fields. And I got to know Freddie
through this,
because I recruited all the agents, William Morris and whatever. And as we got to know each other, I realized Freddie was tired of the agency business, and there was a chance to buy it. So I did buy the agency, and one of their key stars, and they were very big in motion pictures. We were much bigger in television, so it was a great fit. But Steve McQueen was personally handled by Freddie. And Freddie had, or rather Steve had, what we call a key man clause. So if Freddie left, he was out of his contract. Okay. So I never get introduced to Steve, but I had somebody who worked for me who knew Steve in a different capacity. And about 6 months later, I realized that we had the perfect calling card for Steve. We represented the sequel to Gone with the Wind. So I flew down.
He was going to be Red Butler. He was going to take the Clark Gable.
So you should have been a casting agent. That's what I went down to talk to Steve about, to Palm Springs, which is where I was living then. And I said, we represent this. I see you playing the Rhett Butler, Clark Gable role in the sequel. That got his attention. And it's an amusing story. I'll try and tell it cleaned up for television. But Steve then said to me, let's go for a walk. Now, we're in Palm Springs, the most conservative, maybe the richest community in California at that time, probably still today. And we're walking down the main street, and he said he needed to urinate. So I'm looking around. Is there a gas station? Is there a restaurant or something? And finally, not very long, after 30, 60 seconds, he just unzips his pants and does his business. That was a test. And I passed the test because I thought, that's his problem, not my problem. He wanted to see if I'd be embarrassed.
And he was also the person who was instrumental in teaching you to get involved with karate.
Yeah. Well, so now I have Steve as a client. And by the way, Steve had been paying CMA 7.5%. I said, I can't make a deal with you at 7.5%.
I got to get my 10.
Because everybody else here is paying 10. I'm not saying that always was the case later, but he agreed to 10% and signed a contract. So Steve said to me one day, you want to come watch me take my karate lesson? So I said, oh yeah. I mean, I'd never had any martial arts training, but I'd started going to a gym, so I was in pretty good shape. And of course, Steve thought I was a New York intellectual, also Jewish, that means intellectual, blah, blah, blah. So he, about halfway through the lesson, it's an hour lesson, Steve is out of gas. This is what eventually killed him, mesothelioma. It's the cancer of the lining of the lungs. It was from a Marine Corps training accident. Right. But I didn't know that at the time. And so he said, you want to finish my lesson? So I said, yes, and I did a few punches, and I did some sit-ups.
With 1 minute left, I would be totally incorrect if I didn't tell people about, over the years, besides representing Steve McQueen, there was a guy who left working for the government by the name of Henry Kissinger, who you represented Henry in all his works, both literary and TV when he was signed the contract with NBC. You were involved with Margaret Thatcher. You were involved with General Schwarzkopf, a person by the name of Tommy Franks.
And don't leave out Colin Powell.
I was waiting for that. I mean,
no,
a City College graduate, I can never forget, you know, Colin Powell. Well, you were involved with the first book.
And I want to bring you up to date because his book came out, his new book called It Worked for Me, came out officially May 22, and last Saturday it appeared for its debut #1 on the Wall Street Journal book list, which is actually a much more complete sampling than the New York Times list.
And the interesting thing is his agent is still Marvin Josephson.
Absolutely.
So you've been involved with Likud, you've been involved with so many good causes, and you know, even 1 hour is inappropriate, but I'm really happy that we've been able to tell your life story, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you.